Hello, everybody. Philippa again, resident dramaturg for the California Shakespeare Theater, and here is my second lecture on Shakespeare and the mind. And I wanted to say a little something about what gave me the inspiration for this in-depth series. I was thinking about my childhood in Australia and the fact that there was a home for the elderly on the outskirts of town. And my family used to visit a lady called Mercy, who's long since dead. She, at the age of 17, had had a schizophrenic episode and she entered a mental hospital. She never came out until she was carried out in a coffin. So she was in there for about 7.5 decades. And that was the way of mental illness back in that time. So in the 20th century, that there was still so few options for somebody who had had an episode like that early in the century. Fortunately, things are so different now, but it got me thinking about what things were like in Shakespeare's time and how the playwright, who responded so sensitively to so many areas of life, might actually have responded to mental illness and used it in his plays. I'm going to go on from there to say that Shakespeare may have been familiar with the illness of schizophrenia, which would not actually be given a name or a diagnosis until 3 centuries later. Schizophrenia is possibly manifested in the description of poor Tom in King Lear. I'm going to have our wonderful Jim Carpenter recite a speech by Edgar, who disguises himself as poor Tom, a madman and a beggar, in order to be able to come back and help the father who has outcasted him. Take it away, Jim.
I heard myself proclaimed, and by the happy hollow of a tree escaped the hunt. No port is free, no place that guard and most unusual vigilance does not attend my tasting. For as I may escape, I will preserve myself, and am bethought to take the basest and most poor shape that ever penury and contempt of man brought near to beast. My face of grime with filth, blanket my loins, elf all my hair in knots, and with presented nakedness outface the winds and persecutions of the sky. The country gives me proof and precedent of bedlam beggars who, with roaring voices, strike in their numbed and mortified bare arms pins, wooden pricks, nails, sprigs of rosemary. And with this horrible object from low farms, poor pelting villages, sheepcotes, and mills enforce their charity. Poor Turligood, poor Tom. That's something yet. Edgar, I'm nothing am.
Now, as you would have heard in Jim's recital, poor Tom, as created by Edgar, has delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech and thought, and his socioeconomic status has deteriorated. Symptoms that were later classified as pertaining to schizophrenia. And the fact that Edgar mimics this illness suggests that Shakespeare may even have been one of the people who paid that penny to tour Bedlam, witnessing the distressed inmates banging their heads and uttering what Edgar calls mad speech. In that speech, Edgar, or as poor Tom, associates mental illness with the devil and with a relegation to the level of the beasts. One of the impediments to finding treatments for mental illness in Shakespeare's time was basic medical ignorance of the brain. Dissection of human cadavers was forbidden by religious and state law. Therefore, the medical thinking of the time was based on the ancient physician I mentioned in the last lecture, Galen, who was also banned from cutting up cadavers in Roman times. With the limited physical evidence he had, Galen had divided the brain into 3 ventricles or chambers, with imagination at the front, reason in the middle, and memory at the back. This Galenic theory, as it was called, was eventually challenged by a physician named Vesalius, who, you might be interested to know, died the very year that William Shakespeare was born, 1564. Vesalius was desperate to know more about the human body, and he basically travelled anywhere in Europe that dissection was permitted. He eventually persuaded the mayor of his home in Brussels to allow him to cut up cadavers. Vesalius must have been amazing to watch, everyone. He lectured the whole time he was dissecting, doing both very quickly. His audience was of a group of up to 500 physicians. So that's how we have the name theatre for surgery, because all of these people were watching him as if this was a theatrical piece, which it was actually of its kind. And Vesalius recruited members of no less than the artistician's workshop to attend his dissections and provide stunning illustrations. Vesalius made an important discovery that the human ventricles are not different in shape from those of other mammals, although other animals don't compare to humans when it comes to reasoning powers, or as he believed, or other attributes of what he called the rational or specifically human soul. So Vesalius laid bare an important mystery to a population whose sense of their earthly humanness was rooted in religion. That there is no place in the brain that he could actually call, scientifically nominate as the seat of the soul. And as Sir Thomas Browne would later say, in respect of Vesalius's thinking, as he was looking for a soul and not knowing where it was, thus we are men and we know not how. Physicians in Shakespeare's time divided their loyalties between Vesalius's studies and the age-old ones of Galen. They knew what mental health, ill health, looked like from their perspective, but not what it came from. As I mentioned last week, talk therapy had not yet been introduced. So in the effort to treat mental illness, physicians looked at the brain and the body as a landscape of sorts that they needed to pay strict attention to. They prescribed, for instance, avoidance of certain foods: beets, cabbage, dates, pork, beef, quail, peacocks, freshwater fish, red wine, beer, and ale. They also prescribed herbs that were meant to restore the balance between the 4 humours of the body. They enforced leaching and vomiting, and they even made the dietary recommendation every now and then of, to quote, a roasted mouse eaten whole. There was also prayer, An exorcism, presumably of the devil, since a mentally ill person was often judged to walk apart from God. Or in more extreme or last-ditch cases, there was imprisonment in Bedlam. In 1583, Dr. Philip Barrow's account of melancholy offers a treatment plan that may still resonate today, 4.5 centuries later. He says, and I quote, "Let the sick use wine that is white, thin, and not very old, and let them eschew or avoid wine that is thick and black. Let their exercise be mean or limited. Let them ride or walk by places pleasant and green, or use sailing on water. Also a bath of sweet water with a moist diet. Let the sick use this often as one of the remedies. Sleep is wonderful good for them, as also moderate carnal copulation. Let them be merry as much as may be, and hear musical instruments and singing." Close quote. Now, what you'll notice there is that those remedies or suggested cures are very much designed for wealthy people, not for people who are struggling to support a family of X number of children within the one household, parents, grandparents, perhaps all sleeping in one bed or one room, with the children learning the trade of, for instance, blacksmithing. This kind of cure is for people with money and people with resources. And so one wonders how it was for people who didn't have means, who struggled with mental illness, who didn't have perhaps even a doctor to give a name to what they were suffering, let alone a cure. The second thing here is that as a Shakespeare scholar, and particularly a scholar of King Lear, I'm intrigued by the fact that this treatment recommended by the physician aligns very closely with the sweet music that greets King Lear as he wakens from the healing sleep that has followed his period of madness in the play. How could Shakespeare have known this? He may have read that sweet music was a good remedy, but it's amazing. It could have been instinct. Is it the fact that his daughter Susanna married physician John Hall? Well, she didn't marry him till 1607, and Shakespeare wrote Lear in about 1605. So this is all pure speculation, but it's all the more intriguing for me because it doesn't have a specific answer, just as the mysteries of the mind, the heart, the soul, the things that are in a sense most precious to us, also don't have a clear resolution. Regardless of how Shakespeare learned of music's helpfulness or whether it was sheer intuition, he does use music to suggest a kind of balm to Lear's mental suffering, a recovery mechanism. I'd even go further to suggest that Shakespeare did something very revolutionary with the whole concept of mental illness or mental aberrations. He took madness from a condition that was at that time seen as wholly negative, to be hidden away either in one's own family home or in Bedlam, being a distance from God and possibly a possession by the devil, so wholly negative. And he made this very same condition a path through a metaphorical wilderness to a new kind of resolution that was a positive, that was not yet available to the wholly rational mind. So he sees mental illness or madness as a place to which one can escape and from which one can gain a healing that would not happen without the condition of madness. So he sees the condition that precedes madness as being less than the recovery and thus less of a positive condition than the madness itself. So, how amazing in that time of such relentless negativity to construct this condition that today is familiar to us all and is named by us all, for him to have in that time seen it as such a positive for human recovery. So, the character of poor Tom, as well as the madness endured by Lear in the play, suggests that while, yes, madness is still accompanied by theories of maladjustment and social exclusion, yet this very accompaniment is a kind of disguise for the deeper truth that can be revealed through a departure from the narrow, constrictive, constraining path of reason. Hence the oxymoron that Edgar uses, reason in madness, as he observes Lear, untethered from his familiar self and surroundings. In a time when physicians and the clergy were labouring to find cures for mental disease, Shakespeare went so much further, finding a way to use what he called madness as an extraordinary motif for emotional profundity and discovery. Have a listen again to the passage we heard, Edgar's words, as he transforms himself into poor Tom. Take it away again, Jim.
I heard myself proclaimed, and by the happy hollow of a tree escaped the hunt. No port is free, no place that guard and most unusual vigilance does not attend my tasting. Whiles I may escape, I will preserve myself, and am bethought to take the basest and most poorest shape that ever penury and contempt of man brought near to beast. My face I'll grime with filth, blanket my loins, elf all my hair in knots, and with presented nakedness outface the winds and persecutions of the sky. The country gives me proof and precedent of bedlam beggars who, with roaring voices, strike in their numbed and mortified bare arms pins, wooden bricks, nails, sprigs of rosemary. And with this horrible object from low farms, poor pelting villages, sheepcotes, and mills, enforce their charity. Poor Turligood, poor Tom. That's something yet. Edgar, I nothing am.
Those who were designated as insane were numbed and mortified, stripped of clothing and self-harming. They were sent into the country, which gave proof and precedent, as Edgar names it, of what an insane beggar should look like, since most were sent into the country if they couldn't be locked inside Bedlam. And everyone, I'd love you to consider this for a moment, the image of an old, confused king, stripped of all his power, clinging to the memory of what he never was, except in name and seeming power. Bedlam beggar, who's no less than any man, and yet far more than what he appears to be. both because of the profundity that Lear discovers in that figure, and in practical terms, that poor Tom is actually a nobleman in disguise. There's the image of the fool who speaks truths that no one wants to hear. A group of people at the edge of the world, at the edge of sanity, begging the dreadful question of what it means to be a person and what it takes to be seen fully as a human being. Do we need to go to the extremes of unreason in order to be seen? And then what or who are we seen as in that situation? This is the world of King Lear, and these are fundamental questions to the play, a play that Shakespeare built around the dispossession and madness or perceived madness that is mirrored in the chaos of nature, the chaos of a wild heath and a storm. Through and beneath this chaos lies reason in madness, and from there, after the tempest of the mind abates, lies the discovery of hope. So, as I mentioned before, madness becomes something that Shakespeare comes to see as being like the forest or the sea. Madness estranged a person from their received knowledge of who they were in the world. It allowed them passage into a different terrain, one in which they could rediscover or redefine themselves. Hamlet, whom I mentioned last week, is part of this psychological landscape as well. The appearance of madness allows Hamlet to publicly relinquish agency and to make a journey into discovery of the regions of the psyche and the soul that have heretofore been unavailable. I'll note as well that in such a patriarchal society, there was also a perceived gendered aspect to public perceptions of madness. Mental aberrations in men were often in that society seen as caused by women or by what might be seen as feminized organs. Long before, Aristotle had rationalized hysteria as the movement of the uterus throughout the body, which harmed other organs in both women and men, although men, of course, didn't have a uterus, but could still be affected by this malaise. The term suffocation of the mother was widely accepted as a name for hysteria, and it can be seen in King Lear's painful exclamation about himself, "Oh, how this mother swells up toward my heart. Hysterica passio, down, thou climbing sorrow, thy elements below." Women were often seen themselves as mentally weak and therefore as being close to sin. And taking us back to Adam and Eve, they were often seen as the cause of sin or mental and moral aberration in men. And madness itself was often a descriptor used for those who were suffering from love. Now, where do we go from here? As I ask this question, I want to bring up one more little scene from my life in Australia when I was a child, where my mother worked as a pharmacist in a mental hospital. Back then, people were sent, as I mentioned before, to a mental hospital in their late teens or early 20s with schizophrenia, psychotic episode, anxiety, even, and they would likely never come out again. But what about in Shakespeare's time? Most likely, as mental illness was treated on a case-by-case basis, those who were sent to Bedlam were lifers, with the doors being akin to a one-way street. But what Shakespeare did, as I've been suggesting in this lecture, was to uplift madness to a state of being where the playwright was able to consider unreason as a part of normal daily lives Madness in the way he portrayed it was not so much an illness as a form of transgression that actually afforded release from so-called normality, from the strictures that bind people into prescriptive ways of thinking and being and judging themselves and others. So madness in this sense is not just transgression, but, to my mind, transcendence. For instance, Shakespeare constantly represented passionate love as a form of madness. Lovers and madmen have such seething brains, such shaping fantasies that apprehend more than cool reason ever comprehends. The lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact. Remember those fascinating words from Theseus in A Midsummer Night's Dream? Or let's think of Rosalind in As You Like It. She says, love is merely a madness. Just to sort of close out today's lecture, I want to explore the idea of love and madness a little bit further, specifically in relationship to The Taming of the Shrew. I find it fascinating that Shakespeare uses tropes of madness to portray the two protagonists, the two social outliers, Catherine and Petruchio, in this play. Note where Lucentio says at the top of the play, speaking with Tranio, I have Pisa left and am to Padua come, as he that leaves a shallow plash to plunge him in the deep, and with satiety seeks to quench his thirst. Padua was where the physician Vesalius, whom I was talking about before, studied. Padua was renowned as a site for medical progress and invention, and for the kind of wealth that was accumulated through the exercise of capitalism and what was often tied with reason, therefore. And I wonder whether Shakespeare consciously uses this celebrated site of rationality and success as a background against which to illuminate behaviour that is considered eccentric, abnormal, not necessarily successful, and, as is frequently suggested in this play, downright mad. In other words, the mad capers of the two strangely entitled lovers in Shrew may seem even madder against that sober background of capital and intellectual currency that marks the city of Padua. It's intriguing to me that while Caterina in that play is labelled mad by many characters for her refusal to obey the confines of acceptable womanhood, Petruchio is called mad only after he's gotten involved with Katrina, as if the other characters are suggesting in this obsessively patriarchal society that his association with her has infected him with madness. He's called mad brain, full of spleen, by Caterina. Gremio calls Petruchio a mad brain. When he arrives late to his wedding with Caterina, he's dressed in what's called mad attire, and once married, the union between the two is called by others a mad marriage. And you might listen for a moment to this exchange between Tranio, Lucentio, and Bianca. Tranio says, of all mad matches, never was the like. Lucentio replies, Mistress, what's your opinion of your sister? Bianca says, that being mad herself, she's madly mated. The two characters of Caterina and Petruchio are like a display of mated anarchy in a world where the high finance and scientific celebration of Padua is disrupted by their crazy love journey, like a sort of anti-romantic journey on which Caterina and Petruchio travel. Even at the end of the play, when Kate declares herself happy to be subordinate to her husband, and we might expect that everything has calmed down and the marital bed is to be soberly occupied by a now settled husband and wife and soon to be filled with children, the audience is greeted to a wife who loudly and vociferously castigates other women for daring to step out on the kinds of social transgressions through which she herself used to define her own identity. And Petruchio finishes up the play by winning a bet for having the most obedient wife. Directors have long either tried to make sense of this situation via the sort of nudge, nudge, wink, wink, suggesting that Caterina is secretly controlling her own destiny and laughing at the institution of marriage, or they've sometimes rebuked the play and considered it unperformable as the product of irremediable patriarchal 16th century rules. But what I suggest is that if we look at the play as an exploration of what it takes us and what it makes of us to be eccentric, abnormal, all the ways we can play with that word mad, then I think The Taming of the Shrew provides a fascinating study of the frailty of mating bonds, which once you scrape their surface, exposes the anarchy of human will and desire, the anarchy of human passion. Directors keep trying to see Kate as ironically in control of her fate at the end of the play, but I think that the end of the play intentionally leaves us in mental and emotional dishevelment and upheaval, along with the two characters, Kate and Petruchio, who are there in a marital bed, though they really don't know exactly how or why they got there. I look forward to picking up this question or this suggestion, your responses to it, and to anything else from this lecture in Saturday's study group. Thank you very much, everybody.